Welcome to the Karma School of Business podcast. In this episode, we have a great conversation with Joe DeLuca, operating partner with New Spring Capital. This episode is brought to you today by Blue Wave. I'm Sean Mooney, Blue Wave's founder and CEO. Blue Wave is the go-to expert of those with expertise. Blue Wave connects proactive business builders, including more than 500 of the world's leading private equity firms and thousands of proactive companies, to the very best service providers for their critical, variable, on-point, and on-time business needs. Enjoy. So Joe, we are very excited to have you here today. Thanks for joining us.
Sure, thank you.
So maybe to jump right in, one of the things that I've always appreciated about people who join the private equity industry, there's usually something that brought them to this industry, almost like this siren call that drew them to it. Can you tell us a little bit about what drew you to the industry?
Sure. I used to work for many years, I think it was probably 7 or 8 years, at one of the large strategy consulting firms. Starts with an M. I won't tell you the name. Okay. If you ever come back to me, I will deny it.
Yeah.
But we used to do, obviously work with, all sorts of different companies. And invariably, we were coming up with, great ideas to sort of help build the company and add value. But at the end of the day, let's say 6 months later, 9 months later, you kind of move on and, down the road you go. And after a few years, I said to myself, somebody else is getting rich here. And there must be a different world, And so I was actually talking with one of my clients. He said, you ought to think about private equity investing. And I said, that's an interesting idea. I didn't know a lot about, the world of private equity. This is way back.
Yeah.
Okay? This is, long before it was hip to be in private equity.
Yeah.
And so I started sniffing around the local private equity community where I was working up in Boston. And I really fell in love with the concept. So I pulled a ripcord. I left consulting and hooked up with a really, really small firm that was probably in the middle of their first fund, actually. It was founded by a guy who had spun out of Berkshire Partners. And so we had a little office in the suburbs, and I went there and started working with them. And I didn't know anything about private equity investing. And it was, it was a little bit embarrassing to say because, we weren't trained in doing deals. We were trained in sort of, problem solving for large companies. But over the years, I picked it up and moved around a couple private equity investment firms in between. And so here I am, 25 plus years later. In between, I spent, I think, 7 or 8 years doing, maybe even more than that, 10 years doing independent sponsor deals too. And it's funny how this industry has evolved because it used to be called fundless sponsor.
Yep.
That's not PC anymore.
Yeah,
now you're an independent sponsor.
Well, roll-ups are now buy and builds and consolidation plays.
But that's basically how I got into it. I said, I really want to be doing the things that I've been doing in consulting, but I want to have economics attached to that. And private equity allowed me the route to hopefully be able to do that.
Yeah, that very much resonates. I was kind of a similar but different path. So I started off in investment banking, and there's that whole idea where you say, this is interesting, it's compelling. I started off actually in a restructuring group, which was very germane for times like now. so I'm dusting off, 20-year-old memories or 20-plus-year memories. And there was that whole idea, it's like, what happens after? And this idea of how do you build value and participate in that value beyond kind of a deck that you leave for someone else to do? And it was always this kind of consternation that it's like, I'd really like to be part of doing that thing. And I grew up in a family business, so I grew up wearing steel toe boots and hard helmets and working at the plants. I was an expert at painting things safety yellow in high school. So I think under my fingernails there's probably some yellow paint. But for exactly the reason you said, I think that's what brings a lot of people to it, is if you're curious, you like to build things. You probably had erector sets or Legos as a kid.
Yeah, I was one of them.
Erector sets, for those who don't know, is this almost like this really cool scaffolding robotic type device that existed a long time ago.
Yeah, it's before, I think, Roblox is the video game.
It was like the 70s and 80s version of Roblox. So that's great. So one of the things, Joe, that I really like asking people to kind of learn maybe a little of the story behind the story is, we would know you better if we knew this about you. So what's one of the things that we would know you better?
So there's probably a couple things. I think the first one is, if you came into my house and looked at my bookshelf, you'd get a pretty good snapshot of, sort of who I am or what I'm interested in and what makes me tick. And the second way, I think, is if you come and hang out with me and you're open to do this with me a weekend at the shore in the summertime or even in the wintertime, you'll learn a lot about. So on the first one, relative to the bookshelf, it's true. I find myself when I go visit people, even unconsciously, just sort of gravitating to like, wow, what's on their shelf? And I think about, what they're reading or what they've read and what their interests are. And I've always been like that. So if you came over and you looked, you'd see a lot of you'd be very diverse subjects. We'd go from religion to stories about the sea and the ocean to, trashy novels.
Yeah.
It would be all over
the
map.
whole spectrum,
Right.
depending whether you're on the beach or you're at your chair before you go to bed.
Yeah. And if you came over to the shore, you'd spend some time working on boats with me. We'd be doing little home projects, where we shouldn't be like doing electrical, but we're still doing electrical. Or we'd be fishing or kayaking or, paddling or fishing or fixing boats or fishing. Or,
Yeah.
So that's what we'd be doing.
Probably some good pizza.
We'll throw it in for you.
Yeah.
So that's how you know a little bit more about, who I am.
That's great. No, I have. I'm one of these dabblers with reading, where I have 10 books at any time that I'm reading pieces through, and I jump almost like switching channels. You go through, and you're always just finding different little pieces. And so I 100% appreciate that. And my trivia was, certainly right out of college, I had a shore house in Belmar, and so a little bit northern, a little rowdier, a little more budget friendly for.
Did you have like I think they used to call it quarter share or half share?
Yeah, I think I had a half share every other Saturday and Sunday. I'd get to go, and we would pack 50 people into this poor house. None of us had 2 nickels to scratch, but it was one of the best times of our lives. I
Absolutely.
think, as you look back upon it, as people are like sleeping like sideways and diagonal as we packed into these rooms. But what a wonderful place to live, and certainly for me, it was kind of a coming of age experience. So one of the things that I really like about the private equity industry and the people that are drawn to it is this sense that there's this idea of like, we're going to overcome, this too shall pass, we're going to find ways. And as I think about my career when I was in PE and certainly also at Blue Wave, was every time the way things happened in life and in business, et cetera, they never really happened for reasons I thought it'd be. Not one model happened, like there was never the serendipitous like march that the model in the Sims said. And so I think people have this ability in the industry to kind of get to a roadblock and find a way to overcome. And it's certainly a challenging industry. What's one of the things that, as you reflect back on your life and business and career, that was maybe a hard thing that you had to work through and overcome?
Well, I would imagine a lot of people have a favorite pandemic story, right?
Yeah.
Because it was challenging for everybody in some way or another. So I would pick one example from my COVID story. Was right at the beginning of COVID, sort of February, March, and we had a portfolio company up in New York City, and I'm in the Philadelphia area, as you know. We had a portfolio company up in the New York City area, and we had invested in it probably 18 months prior to when COVID hit. And at that point in time, it had gone through 2 CEOs, a CFO, a COO, a failed IT implementation, all in 18 months. I mean, the company was just reeling. And then COVID hit, and a chairman. And so it was without a chairman and without a CEO. And I had to go up there and run this business. So, and it's in Queens, right, which is in the bullseye of COVID.
Yeah.
Right. And so here I am sort of, and nobody in the world has figured out like, what are the implications of COVID? Where is this going? I said goodbye to my family. I kind of moved, went up and found, it was easy to find rooms in that area of the city at that time. And started, introducing myself to this company. We had 110 employees, and they had to be in the building every day because it's an institutional pharmacy. We were an essential business, right? We're doing meds for, transplant patients and people with AIDS and HIV and CF and these are really bad, serious diseases, and they need their meds. And so we had to
probably
be
more
in
than
business.
anyone.
Right. So that was challenging because we all had to figure it out together. Like, are people coming in? They're wearing masks. Are we able to deliver these meds to the people in their homes? Well, we had a fleet of drivers, for example, and we had to pivot the whole business because the fleet of drivers, no driver was going into a building anymore. They would, drive up, but they couldn't get into the buildings. So how do you deliver meds to people in buildings around the city? And So we had to figure all that out, and it was very challenging, while at the same time just trying to keep people safe, keep people, feeling like they can come into work and be protected. And it's New York City, so it's very, very tight confines, right? Real estate, New York's real estate. So it was very challenging. I think, we thought we had the thing under control and stabilized. And then we sort of came into this new, about 9 months later, I was still there running the business, and the vaccine came out. And now we had to pivot our business again, which is we were one of the first people. I'll never forget this. One day, the armed guards show up and the truck rolls up, and I got 10,000 doses of the vaccine to put in my refrigerator. And I was like, holy crap, like, we're one of the first people in the world to get this stuff.
Wow.
And it's going in here. And so we pivoted our business to basically being, institutional pharmacy, delivering these other meds, to how do we go out in the community and vaccinate people? How do we do that? And how do we get paid to do that? And basically the state, the governor's office and other authorities have said, just go do it. We will figure out how to pay people, and the paperwork involved in that. So it was, for a whole host of reasons, it was interesting intellectually, but it was very challenging physically and mentally. And our team, we sort of put our heads down and we just went day by day and plowed through it. There was nothing else we could do.
It seems like a dream now, right? All of this thing in the haze. And in some ways, I think this generation, particularly like the kids that were going through it, this is going to be like their 9/11. This life-changing event that changed not only the world, but I think a lot of people's perspectives on how it works and why it works. And it's going to be this thing that I think a lot of people can look proudly on, the challenges that we all face, but finding a way through. And was it perfect? No. But we all found a way through. But those first few weeks were daunting. So when you were kind of called into action, you had to get into Queens, and probably even just finding a hotel, even though there's lots of rooms. It's like, where do you go? What was it? What was that first week like? How did you approach it? How did you kind of like get the lay of the land?
So literally, I walked into the building, which didn't have a sign on it really, because it's institutional, it's not retail. I went in the door. Actually, I had to knock on the door because they didn't know, who I was. I could, And so I said, "Hi, I'm here." I introduced myself, and I tried to just do half of the building at one time and the other half of the building at the other time, and say, "Look, can we just sit together for 15 minutes and talk? We're in this together. Like, what's going on? What's going on in your world?" And you hear the stories of the team. It's like, I'm making a name up, but Mary commutes an hour. She has to take a bus to a train, and it's sort of like her normal commute. How is that going to work, in this world? So I tried to understand with the people that were working at our business, just what was going on, so that we could relate to each other. And then I could ask of them, hey, okay, we really need to do X. And then there was some empathy, and some relationship building in the first week that I just felt was really critical, because it was all happening real time. And instead of just coming in and saying, here's the list of 17 priorities and we're going to work on these from a business perspective, the world wasn't like that for us. It was more like human that first week, as opposed to anything.
I really like that. So one of the things when COVID started taking shape, and I remember I was actually in the Mayo Clinic in February I had this thing going on. And they were saying, we're probably shutting down our hospital next week. So it's this or it, like, let's hope it works. And then you get into this haze where no one knew. I mean, it was really scary at the time. In retrospect, people said, oh, we figured it out. But then I remember exactly, the things that you were going through. And so I started looking at how do you even come up with frameworks, how to act. And what you're describing is exactly kind of like the first step in this framework I saw. There's this really fascinating guy named Colonel John Boyd, who came up through World War II and then the Korean War, and then became a really big part of kind of the military doctrine. But you think about it, they were always working with imperfect information and trying to figure out how to make decisions. And he came up with this construct called OODA loops, OODA loops, OODA.
OODAs.
And so what it stands for is observation, orientation, decision, and action. And the thing that he was saying, the first thing you always have to do is exactly what you did. It's like, let's observe what's going on. Let's listen. Let's figure out the lay of the land. And then you can analyze and orient. Then you can decide, and then you can act. And then you rapidly iterate. So it sounds like you were operating kind of right out of the playbook there.
I was doing UDAs.
Yeah, a little yo, but
No.
it's just that whole concept. And so we used it all through COVID, and it was tremendously helpful. But what you did naturally was exactly what, this really, one of a kind thought leader would say you should. So 100% appreciate that.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that, because I was looking, we were talking about all of our portfolio companies every week, that time especially. And I think my observation was a lot of our CEOs, they basically switched into instinct mode because they had to. And it was very interesting to just watch it play out. Some people just killed it. It was unbelievable. Like, they completely changed their business model, and the things that they were able to do, these people running the businesses, it was fantastic. And a lot of it was it wasn't by the book, right? For anybody, it was neat.
So Joe, you've got this really interesting vantage, having come up through industry, also being in private equity, being a consultant, and now being an operating partner for NewSpring. And one of the things that I think, the cliche in private equity is you've seen one private equity firm, you've seen one private equity firm. Everyone does it a little bit differently. So how does your firm approach value creation, and what resources do you all bring to bear for your portfolio companies, kind of like what we were just talking about?
So I will say that the model is iterative. We started several years ago with what we called the value creation team. And this was a team of people that were not employees of NewSpring. It was 10 to 12 people, external people. And the concept was, well, let's get somebody from each of the disciplines. Let's have a finance person, a marketing person, an HR person, an IT person. You sort of get the idea. And let's have them on tap to call on them and add value where and when needed. So we started to do that. And, for a couple of years, it worked in some instances, and for a lot of reasons it didn't work. And so then we did a reboot a few years ago. And one of the things that I got involved in when we were doing the reboot, I went out and did a little consulting study, and I interviewed 40 people, 20 operating partners, 15 people from private equity firms around the country, other people in the value chain, just to talk about the role of operating partners, the role of value creation in private equity. And I sort of synthesized and came up with recommendations for how we should do reboot, version 2 at NewSpring. So anyway, what we've moved on to is really, because we have 5 different investment strategies at NewSpring, instead of having a value creation or operating partner group that serves all, we go strategy by strategy. So I happen to be in the mezzanine strategy, dedicated to that strategy now, whereas before I was sort of trying to do, a lot of the other strategies. And it just, for a lot of reasons, it doesn't work. So basically, we suit up with strategy jerseys now. And now we're adding to the team. The roles that we play and where we get involved, we still use these third-party people frequently, because there's so much ground to cover. Unless you're a mega fund and you're able to afford to have a person in HR, a person in marketing, a person in, that focuses from an operating partner perspective just on that discipline, you still have to come at it with a generalist approach, and we chopper in these very specific resources as needed. So that's a model that works for us now. I can see as we grow where we may move to a model where we actually bring one or two of the more typical disciplines in-house, like finance and HR or talent. Typically are the ones that are the first to come in-house, because they're just across every portfolio company all day long. You know that you will have, financial issues that you need people to work on, and HR issues that you need, people to work on. So that's the model that we use right now. But like I said, I've talked with lots of other private equity firms, and there's very different ways that people go about doing it that are really interesting and unique. I remember at Francisco Partners out on the West Coast, those guys, they built their own consulting firm, basically after they sort of evolved their model for value creation. It's interesting.
Yeah, that resonates for a whole host of reasons. And I think we probably think of the world in many ways similar. Like, at least you read a lot, I read a lot, and so I view the world through a lot of the things that I've read. And one of the things that you kind of mentioned reminds me of this book, The Lean Startup, which is this great, it's one of the best, certainly the best book I ever read to start Blue Wave, because it saved me from making 1,000 mistakes. And they were the one that came up with this concept of MVP, the minimum viable platform product, however you want to describe it. And it sounds like that's exactly what you did. It's like, let's go have the audacity to talk to your stakeholders and they'll tell you what they want. And so how you went out and talked to 40 different people before you even built it is, I think, incredibly insightful and intuitive in terms of how to build something that your customers want. And then their whole concept, once again, is this idea of you iterate. Like, you're going to just get it going, talk to people, inform it, and almost like OODA loop as well, and then they'll tell you where to take it. So the way that you're iterating here seems very familiar and makes a ton of sense to me, and a lot of what we're seeing. And certainly with the third parties, I intimately appreciate that, because that was something as a lower middle market private equity investor, we needed lots of them. Yeah. And unfortunately, most of the time I spent Googling and calling friends saying, do you know someone who does this? And I was like, oh, these market network concepts will solve this. But I mean, your point, even with the large funds, we work with many, if not most of the large private equity firms and their ops groups as well. And they still have to outsource tons of things because you just can't forecast where your needs are. And I almost think of private equity, it's almost like a craps table, kind of germinating to where we are. You can only cover so much of the board. Everything else you're kind of like, moving and grooving and trying to, kind of fill in chips with. So that makes a ton of sense. So we're obviously in this time that's very fluid. And I think every time is fluid, but this one particularly, as you think about, this recessionary, transitory economy, whatever you want to describe it, you have geopolitical issues, you have, global kind of changes. As you think about the time now, and at face value, it can be kind of scary to people. Where do you find opportunities? What are you thematically sharing with your portfolio companies and saying, here are places you can secure safety, but also find success and opportunity?
So I think that what I generally end up observing across our portfolio, and there's lots of places you can poke your head in and add value. These are small businesses, but invariably one of the big themes is organization for me. And it's organization structure and people. So it's helping those companies take a look at how are they set up from an organization structure perspective. Are our processes properly aligned with the tasks that we're trying to accomplish? Are we sort of aligned organizationally to best serve the customers? And once you start going down the rabbit hole of organization, you invariably, at least my experiences, start to make decisions and improvements in the way you do things, the processes. And so, you're adding value in a whole bunch of different ways that you didn't even, think about, but you came in with the approach of, I'm going to look at the organization, how we're organized. And then the second part of organization, I think where there's always, huge amounts of value that can be added is with the people, right? And so, again, these are small companies that we're investing in, and they really, in most cases haven't had the luxury or been pushed to step back and say, let's talk about talent and talent management across the organization in a systematic way. How are we going to develop people? How are we going to recruit people and retain them? And what are the criteria, to move people on if they're not sort of doing, making the cut. And so just thinking about that in an organized way with the leaders of the businesses, I think, it's a huge way, it's a huge lever to add value in the companies, because then all of a sudden I think like, wow, we never really could afford or had an HR person before. And a week later, like, this is like the best thing. I can't imagine how we got on with that, without this person, for example. And it just goes on and on and on when you're in there doing these, doing this from an organization perspective as it relates to people. So I think organization is always a good go-to to really a theme that across the portfolio company you can't go wrong.
Your point about people I think really makes a lot of sense. It's something that we see every day. And I think particularly when people from the outside think about private equity, they don't think about the investments in people that occur. And I think sadly, most people think of or many people think of the industry as a 1980s movie with Charlie Sheen.
Right. And greed is good.
And those days are long gone. Even if they wanted to, you could never make a return. So even if they were selfishly altruistic, you have to do these things now with people, because it's at the end of the day, notwithstanding everyone's saying anything about ChatGPT, and they said the same thing with the iPhone, the same thing with the internet. People are really what drive these companies. And as we even look at our own data, and you think about this, it's more than 500 PE firms that are using this kind of magic toolbox. And, across all spans of private equity, across size, scale, industry, et cetera. So it gives us kind of like a normalized perspective of what's happening. 2017 or 2018, it was like 17, 18% of the projects. This last quarter, it was upwards of 40%. And so there's been this metamorphosis, and people were always important through all of PE. But right now, I think, in some ways, COVID has catalyzed this whole idea of like, wow, there's by getting the right people, keeping your teams intact, keeping them engaged, we've seen this metamorphosis occur. And so what you're sharing makes a ton of sense. And once again, you all are intuitively doing all these things, and we see the industry kind of taking shape. And now, the biggest single use case we see in private equity is people. It's every quarter, and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And so that's something that I think people don't necessarily understand or appreciate about the industry, is even if the industry is totally return generated, the only way they're going to do it is by bringing in great people and making them successful.
Yeah, definitely. There's not enough of us to go around, and it's not our jobs. It's the company's jobs to run themselves ultimately. And so the way we get leverage in those situations is we can help identify problems and solve problems and do it for a while, but long term, right? You got to have the right people doing it. Yeah.
Business in the world becomes a lot easier when you have great people. And I think I always appreciated that the way I grew up in private equity in that regard, but now leading a business, you truly appreciate it. If you just bring in great people, the rest becomes so much easier. And it probably took me way too long to learn that, which is the reason why the only hair I have left is gray.
Sometimes I say, when I was in business school, the course that I blew off the most was organizational behavior, right? Give me finance, give me accounting. Okay, those are interesting. And now 90% of my job every day is organizational behavior. It really is.
I think that's very spot on and insightful. So, Joe, one of the things I'd love to wrap up here is I'm really curious. And so you're an avid reader, and you've got this great bookshelves, I'm sure, with these great books. What are, one or two or some of your favorite books, either personal or business, that have made an impact?
There's so many. I'll tell you one, though. It's you can draw a whole bunch. I draw a whole bunch of parallels from this book, for life in general and business. But one of my favorites, and to be favorite, you have to be read at least 3 times in my house. Okay.
There's lots of notes in the edges.
So, The Making of the Atomic Bomb by Richard Rhodes. It's, according to me, it's unbelievable.
Really?
It's a great book. So the first 350 pages, are just a history of nuclear physics. Okay. So this is like going back to Chadwick and Rutherford, Lisa Meitner, the real pillars of nuclear physics. It's really interesting and cool. And then the next 450 pages are like the making of the atomic bomb, and the Manhattan Project.
Wow.
And it's an awesome book. I mean, it gives me goosebumps when I pick it up, and I can just jump into it in any place and be just totally overwhelmed by the task that they had to accomplish. It's incredible.
What were some of the takeaways?
So here's one, which is, you've got this guy, General Leslie Groves, who from the government and the military is sort of in charge of the Manhattan Project. And then you have the polar opposite in Robert Oppenheimer running the scientific, and the technical aspect of the project. These guys pulled it off, and they were completely opposites. I mean, they were like the stereotypes. You got a cigar chewing, belligerent sort of general, and you've got a really, Oppenheimer probably weighed 120 pounds, 130, just, brilliant physicist, just, a man of the world, and, by a lot of regards, probably a communist, okay? And they worked together over the course of a couple of years to put this thing together and make it happen. Like, how does that ever happen? But it does. So one of the things that always is inspiring to me from that, and in a parallel to business, is no matter what the task is, there is a way to do it. There is a way. I mean, people, how do we build, like, how do we make this work? Like, how do we get these people to work together? There's a way to do it if you really, 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 really want to drive on it and spend the time. And these guys, they spent the time, they worked on it, and they got it done. So I think that's a lesson, for me at least, I can use everywhere, and it's inspiring. At least for a short period of time, though, because they weren't going to be working together for 5 years. But if you put them in a room for 2 years, they can get this stuff done. The same with all the other people that were involved in that project, the tens of thousands of people that were involved. For a short period of time, they came together and got it done. I mean, they can't fix the potholes in the road, around my house in 2 years, but they can build an atomic bomb, right? In 18 months. It's unbelievable.
Where there's a will, there's a way. And after our conversation, I can see why that book really, really kind of like registers with you, because it's everything we've talked about here. If you work with great people, you kind of understand the situation, come up with a plan, and if you're tenacious and you're going to find a way. And I think that so much just reflects this whole conversation that we've had here today. So Joe, thank you so much. I'm going to order that book right after this conversation.
You can borrow my copy when you come to the shore.
I would love that. So thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.
Special thanks to Joe for joining. If you'd like to learn more about Joe and New Spring Capital, please see the episode notes. That's all we have for today. For more information on this podcast and Blue Wave, go to bluewave.net/podcast. That's BLUWAVE. Please continue to look for us anywhere you find your favorite podcasts, including Apple, Google, and Spotify. We truly appreciate your support. If you like what you hear, please follow, review, and share. It really helps us when you do those things. So thank you in advance. In the meantime, let us know if there's anything we can do to support your success. Onward.